Welcome to Sports Ophthalmology, a podcast for ophthalmologists and trainees interested in providing eye care to athletes. I am your host, Jared Tuttle. Join me as we hear from national leaders in this exciting subfield of ophthalmology. To celebrate the 10th episode of Sports Ophthalmology, we are releasing a survey to evaluate its impact. Please click on the link within the episode description to complete the 2-minute survey. We greatly appreciate your insights and feedback. Dr. Daniel Laby is a board-certified ophthalmologist with 30 years of experience in sports and performance vision. Dr. Laby received his medical degree and completed ophthalmology residency at George Washington University and completed a fellowship in pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus surgery at UCLA. Dr. Laby has worked with professional athletes in baseball, hockey, basketball, and Olympic sports, contributing to 8 professional baseball championship teams. Dr. Laby has organized 3 international Sports Vision meetings and has organized and moderates the Sports Vision ListServ. He is frequently involved in Sports Vision scientific publications and was an assistant clinical professor at the Harvard Medical School and served as Director of Sports and Performance Vision at the State University of New York College of Optometry. All right, Dr. Laby, we are lucky to have you on the podcast. Thanks for coming today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It'll be fun.
So, how did you get involved with sports and performance vision?
Totally by accident, truthfully. As a youngster, I was not very athletic. I did actually make the varsity golf team in high school, but that was only because they needed 6 people and they only had 5, so I was number 6. So I never really was the athletic type. But when I got to, I followed as a fan, but nothing more than that. When I got to UCLA to do my fellowship, there was a project that needed to be completed from the previous fellow, and it involved some work they had done with the LA Dodgers a few months before I arrived. And that project had to get finished, had to get analyzed, the data written up for a paper and so forth. And basically it came down to, we want you to do it. And I said, I'll do it, happy to do it, but I want to be number 1 author on the paper and kind of running the thing. And the answer was yes, and that started my journey.
There you go. And so that was pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus surgery fellowship.
Right.
And then from there, did you have a pediatric ophthalmology practice and kind of get involved with sports on the side, or how did that go?
Yeah, so I kind of did both for many years, and I'm frankly still doing both to some extent. The ratio of one to the other has changed quite a bit. It started out, being more pediatric ophthalmology. That's where the money was. I was able to have a sustained, reliable income. The sports at that point for many years only had one team that I worked with. In the beginning with that team, it wasn't for any payment. It was volunteer. They paid expenses, but it was volunteer. And so it didn't bring in any revenue. And so there was certainly much more in the pediatric office practice than there was in sports. But over the years, I think as teams have learned about, what we do and the success we've had, we've seen a increase in the number of teams, increase in sports, certainly the revenue, where the point now is the revenue is higher than my pediatric practice. And, I'm cutting that back because I do 3 days a week now. We'll be back to 2 days a week in June. And, I enjoy it. I enjoy taking care of the kids. So I'll probably keep doing it for that reason, but certainly not. My main thrust is now much more into sports and to understand the visual system and how it functions and how it can aid an athlete in the performance of sports.
So how did your pediatric ophthalmology training impact your work within sports vision training?
Yeah, that's a good question. If we think about the different areas of specialty in ophthalmology, cataract, glaucoma, retina, neuro-ophthalmology, pediatrics, cornea, external disease, I probably skipped some there, but that's most of them. If you think about which one of those specialties applies most to sports, it's going to be pediatric ophthalmology. Pediatric ophthalmology, because we're very concerned with how both eyes are used together in terms of depth perception. We're interested in sharpness and quality of vision, being very careful about the refraction, because we know that children need to improve their visual function over the developmental period, whether it's 7 years old, 9 years old, where vision can still be changed and improved, patching for amblyopia, for example. So we're very precise on many of the same things that are very important to an athlete. As opposed to, for example, retina. Retina is very concerned about the function of the retina, but most kids and most athletes that are young don't have much retinal disease. And so pediatric ophthalmology was the most applicable. And my interest actually in understanding how the visual system works, understanding how we can improve it, and not so much looking at pathology and how things are diseased or not working properly, to look at what's, quote, normal and how that can be optimized for better use. And that has really led me into neurology, into statistics, into vision vision science outside of ophthalmology. Um, and for me, it's been a fascinating journey because I've been able to learn about many things otherwise didn't learn about in my residency or my fellowship, and otherwise wouldn't have known in just practicing.
So that extra kind of topic of vision science, is that something that generally stays within the realm of PhD or optometry, or who is doing most of the work within that area?
Well, it's both for sure. Meetings like Arvo are incredible wealths of information. In that regard. There's many PhDs who have written great books that have been very useful to me in terms of learning how visual system works. Listening, certainly there's podcasts that I think are useful as well. Just if you think about, we learned about rods and cones as being the photoreceptors in the eye, but we didn't hear much about ganglion cells that were photosensitive as well, that were very critical to circadian rhythm and to light and light exposure and things of that nature. We learned about that the optic nerves come together in the chiasm and optic radiations projecting to the V1 part of the brain, but we didn't learn about those pathways that skip that process and go up to the superior colliculus and that are very important in movement detection. And people that the classic case of the person who was blind cortically but is still able to recognize movement in their peripheral vision. And like, how can they do that if they're blind? Well, the reason is because there are pathways that don't go through the visual cortex that are critical to visual function, especially in athletes. When we're talking about an athlete being able to pick up movement in their periphery from the opponents or from their teammates without having to look over there and tip what they're going to do next. So these are areas of vision science that I've been able to learn over the years that may not be that dramatic, but when you finish your residency, you don't learn about these things really that are important. And I think to me, the thrill is discovery. The thrill is to learn something new. When I heard about these ganglion cells, it was like blow my mind. There's more than rods and cones that are receptive to light, and my guess is that we'll find other things in the retina as well as in the brain that relate to vision that we don't have any clue about now. That will be critical to understanding how our visual systems can work at the level they do with the efficiency they do, especially in the elite athlete who has a super fine-tuned visual system.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting a throwback to my neuroanatomy class in this podcast, but that's really great. It's interesting to hear how your MD and continued learning has impacted your work, and you're able to still continue that and making a difference in the lives of these athletes.
Yeah, there's the talk, if you listen to some people about medicine 1.0, medicine 2.0, and medicine 3.0. And we're pretty much in the medicine 2.0 realm, which is treat disease. And what probably is going to be more efficient and more useful is medicine 3.0. We're trying to prevent disease. And if we take that one step further in athletes, it's understanding how the visual system works and how we can optimize it, not just prevent disease, but optimize its normal function. And to me, that really resonated. That approach to try to understand how these things work and connect, and how, different parts of the brain that are outside of the visual pathways, how they're related to vision, and how most of the brain is related to vision one way or another. How those areas and how the brain is the physical aspect of the system, but the functional aspect is more psychology or psychiatry, not so much psychiatry, but psychology. And if we think about things that can influence vision, like bias, for example, you've probably heard about the story where people put a 2x4 on the ground and you ask somebody to walk across it, and it's a no-brainer. They can easily walk across it. Take the 2x4 and put it up at 30 feet and ask them to walk across it. Now all of a sudden their balance is terrible. Well, nothing will change except what they see. What they saw was they were on the ground and nothing was going to happen to them, and they weren't scared about falling because nothing would happen. at 30 feet. Now they see they're 30 feet up. Their vision is influencing their action and their ability to accomplish the task when it's the exact same task. It's the same piece of wood and they have to walk across it the same way. And so the aspect of bias or psychology on visual function to me is really important when you think about athletes who have trained physically, probably maximally, who have practiced, for decades their sport. Why is one guy better than the next? Well, there's a good chance a lot of that has to do with the effect of their emotional status, psychology on their visual function and what their visual perception is in order to achieve, accomplish the task. So how does vision get messed up? Well, that to me is fascinating to try to understand.
Yeah, I've spoken to a lot of ophthalmologists or doctors, and when you bring up vision training or even performance vision in general, they kind of wave their hand and say, "Oh, it's kind of a pseudoscience, not a lot of evidence for it." And so this is something that you've been working on as far as turning it into a science and really understanding the pathway. Yeah, so how has that process been going from pseudoscience to science, or kind of trying to create this evidence?
Well, one of my pet peeves, we'll call it, is if you go back several hundred years, a doctor was a philosopher. It was very broad in their understanding and their interest in different areas of science, of medicine, of health, how the body worked, how the earth works, how the universe works, and so forth. And to some extent, we've swung this pendulum way over to now doctors tend to be chefs. Chefs in terms of having a cookbook and having a protocol and a list, and not really thinking a whole lot, not trying to understand things very much, but simply you come in with this on your cornea, it looks like that. Well, we're going to treat you with this. Next patient. And medicine in general has turned into this corporate system where you have 10 minutes for the patient. After 10 minutes, you got to throw them out because you got another patient. And the pencil pushers up above are looking at, I want a 5% increase in your throughput, and you're like, well, I'm working as fast as I can. I can't really tell people goodbye when they walk in the door without speaking to them. That's not fair to them. But you got to see more people, and it becomes this very rote, rigorous template, non-imaginative practice that frankly people get tired of doing after 10, 20, 30 years because it's the same thing every day. Now some people may enjoy that, but for me that's not what I want to do, and I want to understand more, and that I think is an unfortunate product of modern medicine. And so if we swing it the other way, then you understand why I'm interested in what I'm doing, and I'm willing to hear an idea, analyze it using a scientific method, understand whether it's true or not. And look, every year at spring training, I bring a new instrument in that I think has promise, and we use it and we look at the data. And if that instrument doesn't separate normals from the athletes and doesn't separate, performance, higher stratified performance in terms of ability, then it's not useful to me, and we throw it away. And if we have something that does do that, now I have a system that we can aid our athletes to perform better, help the clubs choose athletes perhaps based on results of screening. And then I want to understand, why is that instrument doing this, and how does it work, and how can I intervene to improve people who are deficient or doing poorly. To me, that's the real physician. That's what we should all be doing. And to me, that's what's motivating to continue this. So if I do that process, I have something that people say may or may not be scientific, but when you publish a paper in a Nature journal or in American Journal of Ophthalmology, it becomes a little bit more believable, and people understand and move on. Now, there are certainly types of vision therapy that I don't think have that basis. And there are things like convergence training that have been shown in multiple studies to be effective. And we can call that vision therapy, and we can say that type of vision therapy is effective. And if you don't agree, then you're going to have to argue with multiple studies. But other types of vision therapy, I think, don't have that support scientifically, and therefore aren't effective. And so my goal has been to study, evaluate, publish in peer-reviewed journals the results, and I have like 50 publications, and show that in a rigorous scientific method, this works, and this shows as it does. And fortunately, several studies have been shown by other groups doing the same type of study with a different instrument to show the same result. So if you have several studies using different systems showing the same result on the same hand-eye coordination or reaction time speed relating to performance on the field in baseball, it's probably true. We're talking on my studies are 450 subjects. Theirs are several hundred. These are fairly large studies showing the same thing. Independent researchers. It gets to be a little hard to say this isn't really true.
So you mentioned some of the metrics or different devices you would use in spring training. On your website, I saw the AVTS testing as a way of going beyond just the standard Snellen visual acuity chart.
Yeah.
Could you speak to some of those metrics that you use in performance vision?
Absolutely, and I think the AVTS and the Snellen chart are a really good starting point for that discussion, because if you understand that, then you'll understand much of what's to come. First of all, if we look at the Snellen chart, we know it's over 100 years old. If you think about whether it's a really good test or not, even if you just look at the retest reliability of the Snellen chart, it's pretty atrocious. It's a line, plus or minus a line, under good conditions. It's a test that doesn't compare at all to how we use our eyes and our vision in everyday life. The Snellen chart is a chart that's 100% contrast, black letters on a white background. You have unlimited viewing time to view that letter. You can change your mind as many times as you want, and as long as your final answer is the right one, you get credit for it, whether you saw it in a moment or you saw it after 30 or 45 seconds. You can imagine driving a car. If you have someone's crossing the street and you need 45 seconds to decide if you're going to hit them or not, you're probably going to hit them. Versus the person who can see immediately, slam on the brakes and avoid a collision, has better vision. And so when we noticed that, and truthfully, when a major pharmaceutical company noticed that the Snellen chart really was not a wonderful endpoint for their clinical research in ophthalmology, they put together a meeting. They brought all kinds of people in, including ourselves, and asked for ideas. What should we do? And our idea was create a system that tests vision using small targets, like the Snellen chart, but targets of variable contrast, some high contrast, some medium, some low contrast, and have variable presentation time of that target, or viewing time of the target. In other words, not to give anybody necessarily only unlimited viewing time. And what we found, using a statistical method that's very well known in other fields, but wasn't ever used in eye care, something called item response theory, which we got, I think, 3 U.S. patents for, multiple international patents on the system using that statistical technique to create the vision test. We saw that we were able to not only take people that were the same Snellen acuity and differentiate them on this test, but this was had much higher fidelity and differentiating ability. And in terms of sports, this test correlated to performance on the field, whereas the Snellen chart does not correlate to performance on the field. Now, certainly 2200 versus 2020 will show a difference. But if you're looking at different levels of acuity on Snellen chart, you're not going to see any relationship to batting performance, for example, whereas on this AVTS test, you will.
Fascinating. Yeah, this is great.
Now, what's interesting about the AVTS, because as I mentioned, it was supported financially, which was a large amount of money to create, because we had to create the test, we had to validate the test, we had to show that it had high retest reliability, we had to using item response theory, we had to actually assign difficulties to different combinations of triplets of size, time, and contrast to know what was hard, what was easy. So we ran several clinical trials, and the company supported this whole effort, so they would have a system they could use to better analyze their medications and their ophthalmic interventions. So the test is somewhat restricted in terms of ophthalmology or eye care. Only they can use it. We can't use it. In terms of sports and several other areas, we can use it as we wish. So unfortunately, at this stage, it's not something that can be widely used by eye care practitioners to evaluate visual function much better than the Snellen chart. And we contractually have to keep it restricted to some extent. So it's only really available through us in the sports realm. It can't really be used in the eye care realm at this point until the company decides they want to release it to anybody. obviously their competition would be able to use it, and that would not be helpful to them. And I think we may not be seeing that for a while.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for covering that. So you work a lot with athletes, and you've opened it up to be able to kind of book an appointment with you at any time. What does that look like? I've talked to some ophthalmologists who do provide eye care to teams, not necessarily vision training, but kind of trauma care, things like that. But this is a different concept as far as meeting with you individually as an individual athlete. What does that meeting look like?
Yeah, this is definitely not trauma care. I don't do any injury, any pathology. I could, but I don't. That's not my area of interest. And so teams often have another ophthalmologist who does that aspect. I'm interested in optimizing the performance on the field, on the court, wherever we're talking, of the athletes that we have. So, next about 2 weeks, I'll be going down to spring training for the 32nd time, I think, to work. There'll be 6 weeks in spring training, taking care of several teams and hundreds of players down there. And then I've also obviously opened it up to not only teams, but to any athlete who wants to participate. Took care of a pretty big name in the United Kingdom in the English Premier League, Trent Alexander-Arnold. That was a one-on-one situation where I went over there and tested him. We did some work together remotely through the internet. It was during the spring, and I was in spring training. And then went back again, and we retested him and put him through some challenges. That whole story is part of the Red Bull documentary that's available to anyone wants on the internet. It's free. Just have to look for something called Trent's Vision, TRENTS' Vision, and you'll find it in the Red Bull website. It's interesting. I think it's an interesting synopsis with lots of explanation about what we test, why we test it, and how to test it, and how to intervene. So if someone comes to work with me individually, most of that is in person in New York City. Sometimes it's away from New York City, sometimes remotely. And that's basically one step past the full eye exam. I pretty much request everyone to have a regular eye exam before, because that's not what I'm doing. I'm going to be looking at things past that. And that involves acuity. I'll use that AVTS test that we mentioned. And I'll be looking for acuity in line with their sport. If you're a boxer, I know what the vision there is. It's probably 20/20. If you're a Premier League or a elite soccer or football player, you're probably around 2015. If you're going to be a baseball player, you better have better than 2015, closer to 2012. Tennis will be the same thing. Each sport has a different visual requirement. So depending on the sport, we'll look for abilities in terms of vision. Often I have to re-refract people. People tend to refract. The person reads a 20/20 Snellen line, and we're finished refracting them. What I end up doing is looking at a little bit of cylinder, maybe off axis, maybe a small spherical change, and we get them to 2015, 2012, and that's what we need. And so I often need to re-refract to finish the job, if you will, for the person who didn't do it fully to begin with. And so I would urge your listeners, Jared, not to stop at 20/20. 20/20 is not normal. Certainly not normal for younger people in the 20s, teens and 20s. That's not normal vision. 2015 is more normal, and that means a little bit, another minute or two, maybe of some refracting, but it will ultimately maximize the vision for the patient. So it starts there, and we may look at contact lenses that they didn't have. I may have to have a toric lens because someone took a shortcut and gave a spherical equivalent lens as opposed to a full spherocylindrical lens. And so I may have to do that as well. Then we'll look at, through the testing, we can see if the contrast is off, and maybe we need a tinted lens filter, glasses like an orange or a yellow to help bring out a little bit more contrast, again, depending on the sport. If someone is slow in their vision, if you will, if they need to have a long exposure to understand what's happening, there's some ways we can train that with some apps as well. And then we move on to other more physical things that have to do with the eyes, like hand-eye coordination, reaction time, anticipation, things of that nature, that visual concentration, multiple target tracking, things like that take whole thing's about an hour and a half to go through all that. And once we identify any weakness areas, we try to intervene, which may be contacts, glasses, training. It depends, until we get all the different functions that are critical to that sport at least to the normal level, if not maybe a little bit past that, to help the athlete.
So are contacts the best way of getting them to that 2015, 2012? Do you find refractive surgery being the better option? That's one question. And the other question is, does eye protection, is that going to bring someone down from like a 2015 maybe to like 2020, things like that?
So going back, eye protection shouldn't bring somebody down. If we put the refraction in the protective goggles, it shouldn't. The material is not, Trivex polycarbonate shouldn't really affect their acuity. Certainly, some materials may be more comfortable to some than other people. Again, in this process, which we didn't learn at all in residency, is understanding, glasses, different types of frames, wrap of lenses, different materials that can be used. None of that we had in residency, and all becomes important, not just in the sports, but in practice as well. I have lots of people come in with headaches or feeling uncomfortable, and there's, whether the PD is off, or the temples or the wrap, measurement properly of the A and B values, for the frame, the lens size, all of those things become critical, to performance, and we don't learn anything about that at least I didn't learn anything about that in training. It's not in the AAO books that I've seen. But in any case, so that's the first one. The second point, in terms of best way to correct them, in general, for most sports, contact lenses are going to be the go-to correction method. Not that spectacle lenses are bad, but most people want to have a field of vision, don't want to have anything on their face, not worried about fogging, and things of that nature. You did ask about refractive surgery, and I think that's a very important topic. And I'll give you my bottom line for athletes, and then we'll work back from that. The bottom line is, it's a great procedure the day you retire. That's my response to the majority of athletes that discuss refractive surgery with me. It does depend on the sport. There's lots of factors, but if you think about baseball, that's definitely the right answer. We published a paper probably a decade ago already looking at the on-field performance of players who had before and after the refractive procedure. And so we didn't really care about what the procedure was, or the refraction, or their vision, or anything. We wanted to see, did doing the procedure help them perform better statistically or not? Because most of the time, these guys will say, well, the contacts are bothering me, they fall out, they fog, they don't feel comfortable, I have to blink too much, they're dry, a long list of complaints. And because of that, I'm not being able to perform or bat as I need to. And so we were curious, is that true? And we looked at, I think 30, maybe 30, all the players we could find that have publicly said we had a procedure here. And so we looked at their vision before and after several seasons, so one off, and we found no statistical difference between pre and post procedure. So it didn't hurt them, and it didn't help them. And this is on a group basis, right? There were some that did better, some did worse, but overall. Well, that's important, because no surgical procedure is without risk. There is also always some risk. If you're not performing better by having the procedure, then why take on any risk that could, if you had a bad outcome, significantly affect your career? And, if you look at guys like Tiger Woods, who are proponents of places like TLC, you find out that he had 2 or 3 different procedures to touch up his vision. If you look at a baseball player like Brian McCann, catcher for the Braves many years, when he had his procedure, he had to go back and forth between the DL and between minor league assignments every time he had additional surgery, because it didn't work the first time. Now, you'll also hear about people, this is wonderful, it's great, I see perfectly without it. What's your vision? 20/20. My doctor said I had a great result. I'm 20/20 without correction. And I'll say, oh my gosh, we're in trouble. Because with contacts, you were 20/12. Now, without contacts, you're 20/20. 20/12 is the average vision for baseball. Now you're 2 lines worse than the average than what you were before. You lost 2 lines of vision by doing this procedure. You're probably going to negatively impact your performance in picking up spin and picking up the baseball. That's not a good answer. Or you come and tell me your eyes are really dry and you have to put drops in your eyes constantly because your eyes gotten dry. Or you tell me that you had night games, you can't hit well because the lights of the stands are too glare, the field lights are too much glare. Well, we haven't done much for you at this point if those are your complaints. In fact, if we look at, and I have this in some of my talks, if you look at large studies putting together, large cohort studies, meta-analyses looking at previous studies, the average vision post-refractive surgery was like 20, I think it was 2017 to 2019, somewhere in that range was the vision post-op, which if you retire and you had glasses and you're now 2017, 2019, you're fine. That's a great result. But if you're 2012 before and you're still playing baseball, and that's really critical for your performance and your money and your ability to perform well, you've lost vision, and that's not so hot. And I'm not even talking about the people that have significantly lost vision or a lot of irregular astigmatism that's uncorrectable. That's a different topic. But the majority of people who have what's called a successful procedure end up having less vision than they had before, corrected optimally. And in baseball and many sports, that can affect your performance negatively.
So I wanted to switch gears here for a second and pull up your book, Eye of the Champion. Could you speak a little bit as to why you wanted to come out with this book and what are some of the critical topics covered in the book?
Yeah, when I wrote my first book, this is the second book. When I wrote my first book, along with a friend of mine who's passed since then, called The Dictionary of Ophthalmology, I kind of promised myself I'm not doing this again. It was a lot of work. The dictionary was a lot of work, and I had a co-author. We worked on it together. It was a lot of work, but that was 10 or 12 years ago, 15 years ago. And since then, as I've spent more time in sports vision, got much more experience, and have come, I'm not saying the end of my career, but the later part of my career, I wanted to put together something that was different than other books in sports vision that were out there. I wasn't looking at a book that was going to be kind of telling the eye doctor what to do. I wanted to have a book that was more applicable to the public, people interested in sports, obviously, and interested in performing at their best. So I put this book together based on actually a series of 8 lectures that I was giving. I still do give some people remotely, and I gave it in students as well. So probably in the 8, 10, 12 hours worth of lecture material. And I fashioned the book on that framework. And so the book starts out, it has anecdotes of my experience over the years, and there's lots of, I've been fortunate to have an interesting life. Lots of interesting things have happened over the years, from, 8 World Series championships, which, I find pretty incredible when I think about it. The kid who could barely be number 6 on the golf team, to end up with rings with my name on it, with teams and so forth. To me, that's pretty remarkable. To running over the foot of a pretty famous person in baseball. You'll read about that in the book. To taking batting practice, to working with somebody who was severely visually handicapped with something called Usher syndrome, hearing loss with retinitis pigmentosa, and it being able to help her avoid being hit by cars as she crossed the street here in New York City. Lots of stories like that are sprinkled in there, but there's also a ton of science. And I didn't want to create a scientific textbook. So I go through, what visual acuity is in terms of Snellen fraction. We talk about the pathway of vision, starting with the eye all the way through the vision cortex, the more forward parts of the brain, the ventral and dorsal visual streams. We talk about different pathways. We talk about higher levels. We talk about bias and psychology, higher levels of function where the vision is coordinated with a decision followed by motor action. And all this is put together around what we call the sports vision pyramid, which is a paradigm that we use to evaluate, intervene, and treat athletes to maximize their performance. All that's laid out in the book. And then in the very beginning, actually, is what am I looking for? I'm looking for the ability to predict. I want the athlete to be able to predict the future. Not many of us can predict the future, but if you have great vision, you have a better chance to predict the immediate future. And that's really the crux of the visual system, and that's what we want to optimize. So it shouldn't be a hard read. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's like 200 pages, I think, and I have some illustrations and things inside there, some links, QR codes, links to some interesting videos on the web where we can see things like change blindness and other things like that. and I think it's interesting. At least it's interesting to me, and I'm hoping it's interesting for anyone who wants to read it.
That's great. I'm excited. Yeah, I perused your YouTube channel just a little bit, looked at the video on the
Mm-hmm.
quiet eye, and as I was looking at it, I was like, wow, this is something that my dad taught me as a basketball coach. Focus on the rim, just look at it, you know. And so I sent it to him, sent it to all my brothers, and it's just really neat to see. Yeah, these are just interesting topics that I think are accessible to not only a medical audience but also general
Absolutely,
public.
we have they have a special topic section towards the end where we talk about the quiet eye. We talk about neuroplasticity, different ways, external stimulation, whether it's electrical or magnets. There's been commercial devices out prior to that. There's a lot of good research in how we can improve visual function using techniques such as that. These are areas that I think many practitioners don't really think or know much about. But as I mentioned in the beginning, my curiosity leads me to wherever I go. And these are areas that, to me, if there's good science and there's smart people working on it and it has some application, I want to know about it because I want my teams that I work with to win the championship, no matter what sport it is, and I want my athletes to perform at their best. And I've you'll see in the book that there's some athletes I can talk about their names in the book. Some are private; I can't share the information, but the ones who are public, it's in the book. And there's one player MVP of the World Series, another one sealing the World Series for the Red Sox after I did some work with him visually. These are things that it's intellectual stimulating to know whether it works or not, and whether we can make these changes, and B, it's satisfying to have a guy come in who was batting atrocious, terrible in the whole postseason, to get contact lenses and a correction and go out the next day where he was batting a batting average of .017, 17 out of 1,000. That's really bad. But the next day when he went out there, he was 2 for 4. That's 500. And would have been 3 for 4, except for a diving catch by the first baseman for the Cardinals. And one of those hits was a home run, which sealed the game in the World Series for the Red Sox. So, to be able to help a player perform at that level is certainly gratifying, just like it is to have a patient that you cure from disease.
So, what are some of the critical aspects of working with these athletes, and how is that similar to your work in the healthcare clinic and maybe different?
Well, remember, in pediatric ophthalmology, we see kids, often up into 18, 20 years old. And when I go down to the Dominican Republic to look at the players down there for the clubs, every single one of those kids is definitely below 20. Almost 99% probably below 18, and many are in the 15, 16-year-old range. So that's just pediatric eye care, right? It's just making sure your pediatric eye care is at the level of performance in sports, as opposed to something else. So it's extremely tightly interconnected there. I think when and I think my patients hopefully feel this in the clinic, that they're talking to a doctor who's not just looking at a cookbook, that is thinking a little bit outside the box. I'll give you an example. And none of this, I don't come up with all this. It's a matter of reading, listening, putting things together, and trying to figure out what's best. But myopia is basically an epidemic in eye care at this point. And when we look at the fundus, we can see people that are myopic tend to have myopic crescents or peripapillar atrophy and so forth. And so I had a kid yesterday or last week, and the child came in, was about, I think it was 6 or 8 years old. Was plano in one eye, like a +50 in the other eye. So that's less hyperopic than you would think they should be at that age. Normally, they should be more hyperopic. They had some peripapillary changes that were consistent with a process of appearing myopic crescents in the future. Now, the parents weren't myopic at all. Had they been myopic, I would have started that kid, as I have started many other kids, on low-dose atropine eye drops to try to minimize the myopia. This kid, I said, let's give it another 6 to 9 months. Let's see him again. Let's see what happens with his refractive error, because there was no family history really in the parents, in the aunts and uncles, and even the grandparents. or siblings. So there, even though some of the physical metrics were there that we should treat, didn't have enough of the family history that I thought we could wait 6 to 9 months to start that. So again, one kid I did that way, one kid I did that way, based on this constellation of findings. A lot of people I think would have said, let's wait and treat until he becomes myopic. Other people would have said, there's no family history, but he has some signs. Let's start him off early now anyway. But I think the idea is to be analytical and not follow any rote pattern, but to look at all the factors and discuss it with the parents. And that's what we did. I went through the two options. As is usually the case, they said, what would you do if it was your kid? That's a very common question,
Right.
common statement. And so I told them, what I thought, but I leave them the choice. And, one kid didn't get it. One kid may get it in 9 months. If they don't change much of their refractive error, then I'm going to wait longer. In general, my view is the less treatment, the better. On the flip side, we don't want to miss an opportunity to save the child from some of the risks that they can have by being more myopic than they otherwise would be and in the future. So I think it's that bringing that approach into the clinical practice from what I developed in the sports practice, I think has been helpful across the board to everybody.
So for a young ophthalmologist who is in residency, medical school, whatever it might be, who says they're interested in sports and performance vision, what kind of advice would you have for them?
Unfortunately, right now there is no fellowship. There's no postgraduate training in sports vision. I've tried for many years to get a bit more recognized. I think we've made progress. We had the first paper really ever published in a mainstream ophthalmic journal in sports vision back in the American Journal of Ophthalmology in 1996. So from that point forward, there's been a much greater acceptance of this whole field, without a doubt. But it's not at the point yet where there's a society, where there's a certification, where there's a fellowship that you can be trained in. So if you're interested in it, and if you're going to be interested in it, it's not going to be. You shouldn't look at it as being a cookbook to take care of fancy athletes, because the really important athletes are the kids in high school and college who have talent, but vision is holding them back. They're the ones you can make into superstars. That's really fun. And I have one kid I've been seeing since he was in high school, is now in college. He's probably going to be in the Olympic Games in Paris as a goalkeeper for the USA soccer team. And hopefully he'll go on to having a very promising career that we've done a lot of work with. I have other patients similar to that. To me, that's where the really emphasis is. After 30 years of rubbing shoulders with these sometimes big babies at the professional level, not always, but sometimes, it's a little bit less interesting. It's more interesting to have the guys who are hungry to win and who are willing to do something and see how they progress. And when they get to be that point, their gratitude for the help that you gave them, is really important. So if you're interested in going into sports vision, read a lot, have a lot of questions, be inquisitive, seek out people who work in the field to see if you can spend some time with them. We have a student every year at spring training where we bring them and they spend the spring training with us, testing the players. We have different stations and they kind of work in different stations. They see how we do it, what we do, why we do it. That's the way to get your feet wet. Then you start working with local clubs, show that you're able to make a difference. So you know what you're doing. If you're lucky, you'll be able to hook up with a professional team and be able to see more elite athletes. And then you move from there.
Where, as a whole, do you see the field of sports and performance vision going in the future?
So I think the field's at a little bit of a crossroads, to be honest with you, because it is a field where there's a lot of crossover between ophthalmology and optometry. There are far fewer ophthalmologists in this area than there are optometrists. And unfortunately, many of the optometrists are coming out of vision therapy programs and are not following what I would say is the most rigorous scientific method. We talk about that in the book as well. And that means that the results aren't going to be as promising. Last Friday, I was speaking at a conference sponsored by one of the professional baseball teams, and we were talking about a player who had come from a different team to this team, and the fact that the player said, I don't have anything to do with this sports vision stuff because the other guy, all he wanted to do was train everybody. Everyone needed training. And the trainer assured him that Dr. Laby is different. He's looking at each case individually based on the evidence of what you do to decide if you need anything or what you need and so forth. But it's that idea that when you do something wrong, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And if that first impression is sports vision is just baloney because everyone's getting the same treatment and it can't be that everyone's the same, then we've lost that person. Hopefully not, but we may have. And that's that difference. Most ophthalmologists don't think that way, but many optometrists do. Not all, but many. And that becomes a problem because when you have a sports team that had that experience, now they're no longer interested in sports vision. And that makes it much more difficult for someone like me to convince them that they should hire me, pay me a decent amount of money and help them hopefully win a championship. But if they have the impression that it's not going to be worth anything and it's all non-factual, then we can't get anywhere. So that crossroads, I think, is important, and hopefully more scientific people will come in, and we'll be able to convince and keep those who are not practicing, let's say, properly, out of the field to give more credibility and allow greater acceptance.
It is the ophthalmologist the most qualified to be in this field, or is it optometrists as well? I'm like, what is the role within this area?
It's not necessarily an MD or an OD degree that's going to determine whether or not you're going to be a good sports vision specialist. It's all the qualities you spoke about up until this point. Willing to go the extra mile with the refraction. In fact, and you'll see in the book, the person that I've worked with the closest since 1992 in UCLA is an optometrist, an OD PhD optometrist, but he might as well just be a medical ophthalmologist, because he doesn't have the MD degree after his name, but he's far more scientific than many ophthalmologists I know in terms of papers, publications, review of data, practice, and so forth. So by no means do you have to have an MD to be a good sports vision specialist. You have to be somebody who has, like I said before, question things, understand things, explore things, be diligent in optimizing everything. That's who's going to be the good vision specialist, whether it's MD or an OD.
Thank you. One more question before we go. Do you have a favorite sport, and if so, a favorite team?
So that question, would get me into significant trouble because I work in many sports with many teams. So the answer is the team that's interested in optimizing their vision is this week's favorite team. And the more of them, the better. I love it when the World Series comes and both teams in the World Series are teams I take care of. I love it. And that's happened several times. That to me is wonderful because I get 2 rings out of that. A championship and a league champion, a world championship, and a league championship ring. And so that works out well. But as long as the club is interested in the topic, they're my favorite team.
Thank you for listening to Sports Ophthalmology. To stay connected and learn more, you can find us on Twitter, YouTube, and at our website, sportsophthalmology.com. Please don't forget to click on the link in the episode description to complete the 2-minute evaluation survey.